I've reluctantly come to the conclusion that the Fermi paradox probably tells us that intelligent, technologically capable life is probably pretty rare in the universe. It's even possible that this is unique to the Earth. I mean, I come to this reluctantly. I mean, certainly when I was a bit younger, I was in the Carl Sagan camp, and I thought, life is going to be really common. It's not just life, but technically capable life. Um, but the more I've thought about it, the harder I've found it to reconcile this with the Fermi's question. So, but if it were the case that life is really rare and techno and or technologically capable intelligent life is really rare, then yeah, it puts a huge responsibility on our shoulders because it means that planet Earth, this absolutely amazing thing has happened on planet Earth that's happened nowhere else or very, very few places, namely the origin and evolution of life that's played out on this planet over 4,000 million years of the Earth's history. And for better or worse, this planet is now in our hands. It's in human hands because we have become so technically capable that we can destroy this planet if we really set our minds to it. So let's hope we don't. But that would be, that would be a tragedy of cosmic proportions because we might destroy the only inhabited planet in the universe. So yeah, I think it's got huge ethical implications. Um, of course, even if life elsewhere turns out to be not rare, I mean, life on Earth, that doesn't mean life on Earth is not important anymore. I mean, you could claim that life on Earth was no longer unique if we find that life is common elsewhere, so that would be good. But still, our particular biology is our particular evolutionary histories, when it comes to the evolution of human beings, our particular species and our particular cultures. I mean, these are still going to be unique. They're not going to be duplicated anywhere else. So
Mm.
actually, however you look at it, we've got a huge responsibility on our shoulders looking after this planet and making sure that life continues on this planet.
Welcome to another episode of the Jeoffrey Sarpong podcast. My guest today is Professor Ian Crawford. Professor Crawford is an astronomer turned planetary scientist and is currently Professor of Planetary Science and Astrobiology at Birkbeck College, University of London. The main focus of his research is in the area of lunar exploration, including the remote sensing of the lunar surface and the laboratory analysis of lunar samples. Ian also has a research interest in the field of astrobiology, especially Martian analogue environments on Earth and in the future of space exploration, which he believes will become increasingly important for the future of humanity. This was an incredible discussion about astrobiology and the search for extraterrestrial life. I hope you enjoyed this episode, because I certainly did, and I learned a lot from this episode. Make sure to check out the description for a more detailed summary of all of Professor Ian Crawford's work. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Ian Crawford. First off, can you tell me what the Fermi Paradox is, and why do you think so many people are fascinated by this idea?
Yes, so the Fermi paradox goes back, it's named after the Italian-American physicist Enrico Fermi, and it dates from 1951. And then there was a conversation at a nuclear physics laboratory in the US in 1951, Los Alamos. And the story, for a long time, people thought it was apocryphal, but actually it is now documented. So there was this conversation amongst the physicists at Los Alamos one lunchtime, and about life in the universe. And someone said, well, there are so many stars, millions and millions of stars, so we can't be the only one. There must be life everywhere. And that's a very common thought, of course. And Fermi asked, well, where are they? If they're really there, where are they? Because some of them must be really technically very advanced. And they ought to have been visiting us by now, or we ought to see things, evidence of their activities. So this is really a question rather than a paradox. Fermi just asked the question, well, if they're there, where are they? And we don't see them. So there has to be an answer to this question. It becomes a paradox if you agree that life really has to be common in the universe. Then yes, it does become a paradox because if life is really common, we don't see it. So that is Fermi's paradox.
Mm. And I think that's idea kind of like for me brings up the question of how likely it is, comparing our evolution and where we've gone to and how the fact that we've been able to, being able to look out into the stars, how likely is it that another civilization has gone to that level? How likely is it there are alien civilizations out there, you would say?
So we don't know. And that's really what the whole science of astrobiology is trying to find out. Because one can argue it both ways. I mean, we now know that planets are really common. So if life is not common in the universe, it's not because there's a shortage of planets. We know the basic chemical elements are all the same through the universe. We know the physical laws are the same. A planet plus the chemical elements that we know and the physical laws that we know, they did produce life on Earth. So you'd think they probably would have produced life in other places as well. And yet Fermi's question remains. We don't see any evidence for life elsewhere. So it's true, we haven't looked as hard as we could. Perhaps we should keep looking. That's what the whole science of astrobiology is trying to do, to find evidence for life elsewhere. But it does remain the case that if some of this life had become really technologically sophisticated, probably much more sophisticated than we are now, they ought to be capable of doing things that we would have noticed in the universe, and we don't.
Mm,
So the honest answer is we don't know. All we can do is continue to look. If we
mm,
don't look, we'll never find. I mean, that's true for anything. So we have to continue to search. We have to continue to explore our own solar system. We have to continue to search these planets that we've now found around other stars with our telescopes to look for signs of life. And hopefully one day we'll get an answer.
Let's talk about what we do know then. From what we have found, because I know that we found some, I guess evidence of kind of like erosion or like stuff that would symbolize a planet was, kind of habitable in the past. Is that correct? What are some of the stuff that we have found that could point towards a possibility of alien civilizations out there?
Well, I'm not sure. I think we have no evidence for anything that we might deem to be a civilization. That's a slightly anthropomorphic term as well. You could imagine technologies or cultures that wouldn't fit into the classic human definition of a civilization necessarily. But in any case, we have absolutely no evidence yet whether there's any technically sophisticated. Let's put it that way, rather than use the word civilization. We've no evidence yet for technically sophisticated life anywhere else in the universe.
Mm,
But then we haven't got any evidence for any sort of life elsewhere in the universe yet. So many of our activities are focused on the planet Mars. I mean, that might have been what you were alluding to. I mean, Mars in our own solar system, yeah, it was a habitable environment in the past because we look at Mars today and we can see there are these dried up river valleys, there are craters that were once lakes, and this implies that Mars so liquid water is not possible on Mars today. The planet is too cold and the atmospheric pressure is too low. But the fact we've got these dried up river valleys on Mars implies that once upon a time Mars did have liquid water flowing on its surface, implies a thicker atmosphere, warmer temperature. And as far as we can see, that would be habitable, at least for microorganisms. So that's driving a lot of Mars research because I think we're convinced it was once habitable, but we've no idea whether anything actually lived there or not. So that's what we're searching for.
mm,
And getting an answer to that would at least tell us whether life. So I'm going to say simple life, but I'm going to put this in inverted commas because no life is simple. I mean, we talk about microbial life on Mars, but even life like bacteria, if you look at the biochemistry, it's tremendously complicated. But anyway, that's the kind of life we'd be searching for on Mars. And if we were to find evidence of it or fossil evidence for it, then we would at least start to know whether life itself is common or not, because currently we don't know. But then there's clearly a long road. I look from microbes to anything that's going to develop a technically capable civilization. So, I mean, there might be many roadblocks along that route.
mm,
Even simple life is common in the universe, it
mm.
doesn't mean that technically sophisticated life may be common because there are a lot of hard steps that one life might have to transcend in order for its complexity to increase. And we have no idea how common or how probable this would
Mm.
be.
I want to talk about the existence of those kind of microbes that you were speaking about. Is it possible that the evolution works differently on these other planets? Is it how likely is it that we would see if we did? Obviously, you say that we're not sure, and a lot of this stuff where we don't know unless we go out there and do the research ourselves. But how likely is it that evolution would have been similar, or is it that life out there is so different that we might not be even using the right measurements?
Well, I think it's quite likely that the life could be very different,
Mm,
even if the evolutionary mechanism is the same. I mean, our current understanding is evolution of life on Earth has been driven by natural selection. That's a pretty fundamental process that you would think would occur anywhere. But the results of natural selection, the whole point of natural selection is it adapts organisms to their environment. So different environments are going to produce, I mean, they could produce very different organisms and even very different biochemistries. So yeah, we have to be aware that life elsewhere could be very different.
mm,
None of this solves Fermi's paradox, though. In fact, it makes it worse.
hmm
I mean, because not only have we not seen our kind of life, we haven't seen any kind of life. So if there are lots of different kinds of life out there, even different, fundamentally different biochemistries, in addition to our own life, it just means there should be even more types of life out there, some stranger than others. And yet the fact is we haven't found any. So the more you speculate about alternative biochemistries and biologies, which I'm sure, I mean, the universe is a very big place. There must be possibilities for all of these different things.
hmm
But Fermi's question remains. Currently, we have found none of it.
On that question, then, because I often think, you're right. You're looking out there and you kind of see the great silence and you think, how is it possible? And, there's so much out there and, it's almost improbable to me that there isn't a sort of life out there. Do you think is a factor of time? How possible is it that these kind of life has already existed prior and we just haven't been able to find it? Or maybe the machinery that we have currently don't have the ability to reach them.
Yeah, so all of this is true. At the moment, our tools are quite limited. I mean, we think we're making a bit of progress on Mars, searching for evidence for life on Mars billions of years ago, but even that's still early days. The only way we can study exoplanets is to use large telescopes, space telescopes like JWST, to try and see whether there are molecules in the atmospheres of these planets that have been produced by life. So these are called biosignatures, sort of molecules in a planet's atmosphere that might indicate that life exists on the planet. And so we've made a start. But in truth, our current generation of telescopes are not powerful enough, really, to do this properly. So it is all a work in progress. So obviously, it must be true. There could have been life in the past in the history of the universe that's now gone extinct, and there could be life elsewhere in the galaxy today that we haven't noticed. I mean, all of this is true. But Fermi's question still remains. Because if any of this life has evolved into the capability to have the technological capacities greater than our own, this life will have its own agency. They could be doing things. They could be building the spaceships to come to us, and they
Mm,
haven't. Or
mm,
they could be sending radio signals to us, and we've been searching now for 60 years for artificial alien radio signatures. I mean, that's what SETI is all about, and haven't discovered any. So this is the great silence that you referred to. So I still think it remains, although there is a lot of exploration still to do, there is still no real satisfactory answer to Fermi's question.
mm. And from a philosophical point of view, what do you think what do you think the great silence means for us? How does that relate to our own kind of understanding of our kind of precious life that we have here?
So I've reluctantly come to the conclusion that the Fermi paradox probably tells us that intelligent, technologically capable life is probably pretty rare in the universe. It's even possible that this is unique to the Earth. I mean, I come to this reluctantly. I mean, certainly when I was a bit younger, I was in the Carl Sagan camp, and I thought, life is going to be really common. It's not just life, but technically capable life. Um, but the more I've thought about it, the harder I've found it to reconcile this with the Fermi's question. So, but if it were the case that life is really rare and techno and or technologically capable intelligent life is really rare, then yeah, it puts a huge responsibility on our shoulders, because it means that planet Earth, this absolutely amazing thing has happened on planet Earth that's happened nowhere else, or very, very few places, namely the origin and evolution of life that's played out on this planet over 4,000 million years of the Earth's history. And for better or worse, this planet is now in our hands. It's in human hands, because we have become so technically capable that we can destroy this planet if we really set our minds to it. So let's hope we don't. But that would be, that would be a tragedy of cosmic proportions, because we might destroy the only inhabited planet in the universe. So yeah, I think it's got huge ethical implications. Of course, even if life elsewhere turns out to be not rare, I mean, life on Earth, that doesn't mean life on Earth is not important anymore. I mean, you could claim that life on Earth was no longer unique if we find that life is common elsewhere, so that would be good. But still, our particular biologies, our particular evolutionary histories, and when it comes to the evolution of human beings, our particular species and our particular cultures, I mean, these are still going to be unique. They're not going to be duplicated anywhere else. So
Mm.
actually, however you look at it, we've got a huge responsibility on our shoulders looking after this planet and making sure that life continues on this planet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right when you mention about the responsibility, because it not only does it mean we have a responsibility to sustain that, but also we might be the only life that's possible to be able to go out into other planets and discover other, even if it isn't other extraterrestrial life, discover other planets and acquire knowledge elsewhere. Saying on that point about the responsibility that we have, how does that how do we balance that with the idea of like climate change, but like we kind of see how the 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 world is kind of evolving and changing itself. How do we kind of build, like, look at that relationship between how climate change and our kind of ideas about looking elsewhere and going elsewhere, and the role that fixing climate change will have in that, whether it's building rockets and going out there. What is the relationship, you think, between that?
So I think a few things. Firstly, I think human beings are responsible for climate change. I think it's largely happened accidentally, to be
Mm.
fair. We discovered that we could get all this energy by burning coal, and then that we could get all this energy by burning oil, and then it was just so useful, we haven't become addicted to it, basically. We just can't give it up. And now it's becoming really difficult to control, because there are so many vested interests in this fossil fuel industries. Still, it is a human-made problem, and humans can solve it. We know what we have to do to solve it. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to develop renewable sources of energy. And we can do that technically. So then it becomes a political question. How can we organize ourselves on this planet so that we um, mitigate climate change? And it will obviously require strong, in my opinion, it will require stronger international governance structures than we currently have, like something like a much stronger United Nations or something like that, which can actually, well, it would have to enforce. I mean, that's quite a strong word, but it would have to enforce limits on the use of fossil fuels in order to get the potential climate disaster under control. But of course, it's not just climate change. There are many other problems like that which can only be tackled at a global level. There's biodiversity loss, which is linked to climate change, but there are other aspects to it. There's the continuing development of nuclear weapons and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the possibility that these weapons may deliberately or accidentally be used. So they need to be brought under control. So there's pandemics. I mean, in a sense, we're kind of lucky that, I mean, COVID was a disaster on all sorts of levels, but it could have been worse. The next pandemic might be worse. So we're going to need some sort of higher level international controls to deal with these. So I think the answer to your first part of your question is, to deal with these common global problems, we need a higher level of global governance to get our act together on this planet. As to the second part of your question, then this kind of is the idea that you sometimes read about, that if we mess up this planet, then don't worry, we'll just get into our spaceships and we'll go to some other planet. That is not going to work. There's going to be no other planet in the universe as well adapted to human beings as the Earth. And we know that because we have evolved. We've evolved on this planet. We are adapted to it. We haven't evolved on any other planet. So we'll never find any other planet to which human beings are better suited than the Earth. But then if you look around, the only places that we've even got within reach at the moment, which would be like the Moon or Mars, I mean, there is nothing on the Moon or Mars that's comparable to the Earth as a place where humans can live. So I'm all in favor of getting out into space to explore space, partly because this will help us address these astrobiology questions. I'm even quite in favor of, in the fullness of time, setting up small human colonies on the Moon and Mars, and seeing gradually spreading humans out into space. But it will never be a substitute for solving our problems on the Earth. Most human beings are always going to live on the Earth probably for as long as human beings exist, but certainly for the foreseeable future, the vast majority of human beings are going to have to remain living on the Earth. So we have to maintain the Earth's habitability just in our own self-interest. Never mind these other wider philosophical points about we might have in our hands the only inhabited planet in the universe. I mean, that puts extra ethical weight onto us. But just in our own self-interest, we have to manage our affairs on this planet better than we are currently.
Looking at terraforming, then, if I know your point about, and I completely agree about Earth being our home and we need to protect it, and that's why I brought in a climate change conversation, because I think most people don't look at it as a priority. Well, they do, but like you mentioned, there's all these political, geopolitical reasons why they don't look at it as an actual priority. And we're looking at others or other things. But leaning into that terraforming conversation, if we did reach another planet, how would we start to make it livable?
It depends on which planet it is, but I mean, in the very far future, you could speculate about planets orbiting other stars, but we just don't have the technical. We just don't have the technical means to get there at the moment. And it might be possible in a few hundred years that we develop that capability, and we can talk about that if you want. But in the near term, the only other planets are the other planets in our solar system, and the only two really are Venus and Mars. I mean, the Moon is too small to be terraformed. So I don't know whether all your viewers are familiar with the term terraforming. The word terraforming has been coined to take another planet's environment and make it like the Earth. So that's what terraforming means, because terra means earth in Latin. So Earth forming. So this is what it means. So you take some planet that's not at all like the Earth, like Mars, and make it like the Earth, and then maybe people could live on it. So that's what terraforming means. But in our own solar system, we've only got Mars and Venus. They're very different. They're both going to be extremely hard to terraform. I think many people would argue that Venus might be impossible. So then that leaves Mars. It would be a process that would take probably thousands of years. It would involve increasing the thickness of the Martian atmosphere, which is currently very thin, carbon dioxide atmosphere. It would mean finding the water, which was once on the planet, but is no longer on the surface. So that's either escaped to space, which is possible, or it's frozen into the ground, which is also possible. If it's frozen into the ground, then you'd have to ginormous geoengineering project to melt all that ice and bring the water to the surface of Mars, and a thicker atmosphere. And then you'd have to change the composition of the atmosphere so it was breathable by humans. Now, there is a force that we know can do that, because it's done it on our planet, and it's biology. So you could introduce photosynthesizing organisms which would take the carbon dioxide in Mars's atmosphere and produce oxygen. But that's and in a sense, life on Earth terraformed this planet 2.5 billion years ago, because I mean, Earth too had a CO2 atmosphere, and then it was biology that through photosynthesis that gave us what the 20% of the atmosphere that we now have, which is oxygen. But that takes, I mean, on Earth, that took millions of years. Even if you were trying to speed it up artificially, I mean, it would take thousands of years to make Mars a habitable planet. Even if it's possible. I mean, I'm not sure that everyone agrees that it is possible, but that's what terraforming would involve.
Mm. On the question of you mentioned how the best way is able to happen on our planet has been through biology. Is there a way we can, and this is just me kind of like hypothesizing here, is there a way we can, be able to shoot bacteria or like any like microbes onto another planet and let it develop over a long period of time for it to create that kind of
Yeah.
environment? And how feasible is that option?
Yes, I think is the answer to that. Again, you depend which planet we were talking about.
Mm.
So you could look at Mars, or you could longer term look at planets orbiting other stars. Yeah, you would learn as much about these environments as you can, and then you would see whether Earth kind of life might be survive on such an environment. And even if it doesn't, our tools now for genetic engineering are becoming so powerful, we could probably genetically engineer something that would survive on a planetary environment. But you don't know how that would turn out, right? I mean, suppose you found a planet with no life, as far as we could judge, with a carbon dioxide atmosphere, and you genetically engineered some microorganisms that could and send them to this planet to start photosynthesizing to convert the CO2 into oxygen. I mean, that is what happened on the Earth 2.5 billion years ago. Well, as far as we know, this life wasn't injected to the Earth from outside, but 2.5 billion years ago, microorganisms on the Earth learned how to photosynthesize and oxygen built up. And then 2 billion years later, here we are. But you wouldn't. There's no way for you to predict what the outcome would be. And obviously, left to those sorts of timescales, it'd be. I mean, it's a timescale that's just outside of the human, not timescale that's so long it's just not really relevant to human beings. The timescale that it would take to terraform a planet that way.
Mm.
But I mean, I don't think it's no, I'm sure it's not impossible. But
Yeah.
it begs a question though, and it comes back to governance. I mean, I hate to sort of bring this back to sort of geopolitics and everything. But suppose we do find some planet that we think we could introduce Earth life onto, and let the life evolve there, and then see what happened. I mean, this is a pretty big decision to make. So who is going to make it? I mean, who is responsible for the outcome of this activity? Would some individual billionaire with a big rocket, mentioning no names? I mean, should he or she be able to just start terraforming planets because they want to, or would it be some national government? And my argument is that it would fall in that category that really would require an international government. It would be another of those things where someone or some institution can legitimately speak for the human race as a whole, because that's the kind you're kind of making this decision on behalf of everybody. So I actually think there'll be big ethical questions, but also big political questions behind making a decision to deliberately seed another
Yeah.
planet with life from Earth.
Yeah,
I
and
mean,
I'm thinking. The question I have when you mentioned that does that mean that our challenges, although they are kind of enormous about going there, our challenges actually first come from our kind of here. The challenges to even get to that stage where we start looking at, making these decisions, which in the long term could lead to success and discovering other life on other planets, is actually the biggest challenge is actually here. Would you say that, or would you say that actually when we go out there, the challenges there are also just as enormous?
so I think there are multiple challenges. I mean, there's clearly the scientific challenge of finding whether life is out there or not, and that's what the science of astrobiology is all about. And that, I mean, I fully support doing that. Of course, we have to, like I said earlier, unless we search for life, we won't find it. So we have to keep looking. Then there's the engineering challenges of actually getting to these places. Certainly, if we were talking about planets orbiting other stars. I mean, we don't have the capability at the moment, but we might be able to develop it. And then there is the political challenge, yeah, which we're going to have to sort out here, I think, before we start um, moving out too far into the universe. So there are these challenges on multiple fronts, and I think they're all interesting and important challenges, but they're all a bit different from each other.
And looking to the benefits, then, what are some of the tangible benefits that you think if we did complete this terraforming and we had life on other planets, what would life be like? Would we be able to walk around freely like we do here, or would everything be artificial, I suppose?
So that, I mean, again, that depends. For terraforming as it's, to a fully terraformed planet by definition, yeah, it would be such that you'd made another Earth and human beings could just walk around, breathing and living as we would normally, except of course the gravity would be different. Whatever you do to Mars, you're not going to give it an Earth's gravity. So it's always going to, gravity is always going to be about a third of what it is on the Earth. So that would make a few changes. But I think that's really at the extreme end. I mean, that's so technically difficult and it would take so long. I mean, I really do think you'd be looking at thousands, could even be millions of years to terraform, get Mars so it's really like the Earth. But of course, there are several halfway stages. I mean, currently, anyone walking around on the surface of Mars will need a spacesuit because the atmospheric pressure is just so thin. And also, the radiation environment is quite bad. So you need some protection from the cosmic rays. But if you made Mars's atmosphere a bit thicker, then this would give protection from the radiation, and you wouldn't need a spacesuit anymore. Maybe you could move around with something like scuba gear instead of a spacesuit. Or you could then take it a bit further. The atmospheric pressure becomes a bit thicker. It's still not really Earth-like, but you could walk around just with a face mask of some kind. So you can see steps along a terraforming route, where before the planet's terraformed at all, yes, if people live there, they'll have to be in underground dwellings or in domes or something because they'd need to be totally shielded from the environment. And then as the process proceeded a bit, they'd be able to venture outside, and the amount of kit they'd need to survive outside would get less and less. Less of a spacesuit, more of a scuba diving gear. And then eventually, thousands of years later, if the atmosphere has really changed to be really Earth-like, they could, take the respirator off and might be able to survive outside without any support. So I think it would be a history, an evolutionary process like that. If this ever happens, I'm not saying I don't want to be sound there that I'm necessarily an advocate for terraforming. There are big implications, big ethical implications to terraforming because you would take a planet's environment and totally change it for human benefit. So you could argue that, if the planet had no life of its own, then okay, there might not be a very strong ethical argument not to do this, but you'd need to be very sure. I mean, before we suppose Mars has its own life. I mean, they might only be microorganisms, but it is their planet. So we'd have to be very sure that Mars had no life before we started terraforming it, I think. Otherwise, you're literally committing genocide. You've got a whole independently evolved biosphere, and humans come along and destroy it. I mean, this would be wrong, wouldn't it? I mean, I think it would be wrong. So I'm not necessarily an advocate of terraforming Mars, and certainly not until we have a definite answer to the question of whether whether Mars has any life of its own.
I completely agree.
Absolutely need an answer to that question before we can go any further down this road, I think.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think, yeah, there's a lot of like ethical questions that would need to be asked. There's a lot of like conversations that human beings will have to have amongst, even if this is feasible, is it a thing we should do? And I think that's the overall question that I'd like to come back to at the end. But you mentioned time. You mentioned millions of years for us to kind of even get to some of these, or even get to some of these things that we're trying to achieve. Or like on the larger end, I'd say. The question I had is, what role does time play in this? Are we kind of like, are we looking across time as well as space? When in our search for extraterrestrial life, what would you say about that?
So I think so. Firstly, just to come back to the terraforming timescales.
Mm.
I mean, the optimists have a shorter timescale. They might invoke thousands of years. All I can say about millions is that's how long it took life on Earth to essentially terraform the Earth, to turn the Earth from a planet with a carbon dioxide atmosphere to one with a 20% oxygen atmosphere. I mean, that took millions of years. But technically, if one really wanted to do it, probably we could speed it up. And the technologically and the optimists think thousands of years. Um, the time the times I'm saying depends on the relevance of time depends really on what we're talking about, I think. I mean, the the if we just take the Milky Way galaxy, then we know it's got 100,000 million stars in it, and we know it's about 13,000 million years old. So it's almost three times as old as our planet. So this does mean that the history of the galaxy, there's been time, all the things that we're talking about now that humans might do in the future. Had technically capable life evolved in the earlier history of the galaxy, there's been more. I mean, all of this could have played out in the past, right? There's been enough time for intelligent. Again, I almost use the word civilizations. Technically capable um, um, organisms to develop spacefaring technology, terraforming technology, even if it does take them a million years to terraform a planet. The galaxy is thousands of millions of years older than the Earth. So they could have been doing all of this before the Earth even formed. Never mind before humans evolved, right? But then this brings us back to Fermi's question. If they were all there doing this billions of years ago, isn't it strange that when we look out into the sky today, we don't see any of it? We don't see any evidence of terraformed planets. We're pretty confident they never terraformed our planet for their own purposes, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. Nor have they interfered with any of the other planets in our solar system. And anyway, the point is, we look out into the sky today and we can see a lot of interesting astrophysics going on, but we can't see any evidence of minds at work. And arguably, we should be able to do that. Given the deep history of the galaxy, given that there's been so much time for these earlier civilizations to have, so I use the civilization word, these earlier technically capable civilizations to develop and start for themselves expanding out into space and for them to start terraforming things. Wouldn't we notice? Maybe not, but I still think that, I mean, the great silence sort of presses upon us a bit. It's a bit difficult to reconcile a history of the galaxy where all this had been going on for billions and billions of years is a bit difficult to reconcile with, the absence of evidence that the great silence that we're faced with.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think it makes it difficult to even ponder, like, because I think you are right. When you look at the time scale you're mentioning and the size you're mentioning is mind-boggling for me. Like, even thousands and millions of years, human beings, like you said, can't really comprehend that level of like that larger number. So it really makes it a question where when you're questioning this, it more of it's a philosophical pondering. If it was in the future, not us, but another civilization in the future could make this happen, would they find what would they find almost? But I think it's interesting to ask those questions because it says a lot, like we mentioned at the beginning, about our relationship to the like the wider universe and to the wider kind of scope and how evolution of life is even developing. You mentioned something before at the beginning about maybe is the case where life is just that unique. Um, in terms of how it's structured and how evolution has made human beings to be. How likely is that? Is it as an answer to like the great silence, is it that just how we're just very very unique and like not to I'm very careful of making human beings kind of like above in any kind of in any sense of the word any other organism, but it's just that how human beings are unique in that sense. How likely is that?
So the honest answer is, I mean, we just don't know. right? We just we can't know until we start finding other examples of life, or we search so many places and we keep not finding life despite having searched hundreds and hundreds of planets and we never find life. Then we're going to start to think that yeah, life is pretty rare. Um, I think there are several things for several reasons for thinking why life might be rare, actually. So it goes back to these so-called hard steps that I mentioned earlier. So the first thing is life has to arise from non-life. Now, no one knows how that happened. Even the most simple life we're familiar with is vastly complicated than than any non-biological chemical process. So somehow, from a non-living world, this tremendous complexity that is packaged within a single cell had to appear, construct itself, presumably, without any pre-existing life. So in some geochemical way, that might be really hard. We don't know, but we haven't found any other evidences of the independent origin of life. All life on Earth is related. All life on Earth shares a common ancestor. All life on Earth has the same basic biochemistry because we share a common ancestor. So life's got started from non-life somehow on this planet, and then it's evolved since into all its myriad diversity. But the origin of life might be very rare. Even if the origin of life is not very rare, you can then look at the history of life on Earth and you can see some other hard steps. So, for example, human beings and all animals are made of a pretty complicated type of cell, so-called eukaryotes, which are cells with nuclei. And in our nuclei of our cells, this is where our DNA is. Simpler forms of life, so-called prokaryotes, like bacteria, I mean, they don't have nuclei. So the earliest common ancestor of life on Earth would have been something like a bacterium. However, at some point, these prokaryotic cells evolved to become eukaryotic cells with a nucleus and all sorts of additional internal complexities. That might have been a very hard step. Since all animals are built from eukaryotic cells, it implies that unless you could make eukaryotic cells, you're not going to have anything at an animal level of complexity. And by that, I mean anything from a jellyfish upwards, right? All animals are based on eukaryotic cells. Then once you've finally got the eukaryotic cells evolved, you've got then they have to learn how to cooperate in multiples. Multicellular life has to evolve, right? Because I mean, there are plenty of single-celled eukaryotes. So these are called protists. But at some point, some single-celled eukaryotes started to cooperate with other eukaryotic cells to make multi-celled entities, which these days we largely know of as animals. And then, so that's a hard step. If you need something with an animal level of complexity to make spaceships or radio telescopes or to terraform planets or whatnot, then you know that would account why these things might be rare. But then you can go on up the chain. There's consciousness. Where does consciousness arise? I mean, human beings are conscious. Probably other animals on this planet are conscious, but to the same extent, who knows? Is consciousness required before you can start developing a technology? I mean, maybe consciousness, somehow these cells, which are just doing complicated chemical reactions, at least in some life forms, have become conscious. So that could be a very hard step.
A question
So
on that then.
all of these hard steps, right?
Mm.
And each one of them, or several of them in combination, yeah, they could explain the Great Silence because to get technologically capable life, you've had to go through this jump through all of these hoops of hard steps, and this could result in the end product being very rare. Sorry, you were gonna
No, I was
say
gonna on that point because you're making a very fantastic point about the difficulty of it, but I had a question of which step do you think was the hardest? Which step on that kind of life, kind of evolutionary, kind of the chain, would you think is the most amazing? You know, we can look at it like that, where it's like, I can't believe this actually happened. Well,
Since my background is not in biology, I sort of hesitate to give an opinion.
Of course.
But I do know that I mean that, as you might expect, there's a whole range of opinions out there. Um, I have come to suspect that the origin of life itself is probably arguably the hardest step, leaving aside the origin of consciousness, which is just frankly so mysterious. Nobody knows. So maybe that, but even then, I'm not sure. I think we can look at other animals, and I'm pretty sure that they're conscious. Not all of them, but I am aware. I'm pretty conscious. You look at the behavior of certain other animal species. I'm pretty sure they're conscious. So that would imply consciousness isn't unique to humans. Um, the origin of life, yeah, we don't know, but um, I've become quite impressed by an argument. There's an astrobiologist in Germany called Dirk Schultz-McCoo, and Dirk has thought quite hard about this, and he's pretty much convinced me that none of these other hard steps are that hard because they have happened more than once. So even in the history of life on Earth, many of these steps, getting cells to collaborate into multicellular entities, this has happened more than once. It may only have happened a few times, but that, if it's happened more than once, it's not clearly, well, it can't be impossible, or it wouldn't have happened once. But if it's happened more than once, then arguably it's not that improbable. But the origin of life, we don't know. We don't know whether it's happened more than once, because we've only got one example. And that ultimately is why it is so important to search for other independent origins of life, like on Mars, for example, or in the icy moons of the outer solar system, where you've got these moons with liquid water oceans, which are probably habitable places. It's really important to see whether life has evolved into those environments, because that would at least tell us whether the origin of life itself has happened more than once, and to some extent would enable us to uh, argue whether or not the origin of life is a uniquely rare event or not.
Mm.
Until we find another example, we can't answer that question. So finding another example of life off Earth, even if it is only microbes, becomes fantastically important, because it would at least tell us whether the origin of life itself is uniquely unlikely.
Would that change how we view life, do you suppose? And like obviously it would, in the sense that we know there's more about there, but would that change the kind of the value or like anything we see about life itself, do you think?
I think it will change our view of life, because we'll immediately know that life on Earth is only one subset of possible life, and that other lives forms of life with independent origins exist. So it would inform our location in the universe. Yeah, well, it would help inform our location in the universe, because we would know that our kind of life is no longer unique. So at least we wouldn't be alone in that sense. There would be other lives out there, other totally independent biologies. Whether it has any deeper ethical implications, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm happy with what I said earlier. I think that um, if if it turns out that the planet Earth is the only planet on which life itself exists, then this puts an enormous responsibility on us to continue to protect it. But even if it turns out that there are other biologies out there, it still remains true that our kind of life on this particular planet is still unique in many respects. So we should still be looking after it. So however you cut this, I think the top level ethical issue that's on our shoulders is the same, and it's to maintain the habitability of our own planet, both for ourselves and all the other creatures that
Yeah,
we share the
yeah.
planet.
Yeah, I for one hope we can discover more life out there because I think it shows the beauty of life itself. I think to be able to kind of grow in these incredible environments, and I think it kind of shows something about how even on our planet, just if our issues we can overcome them. I'd hope that will be what we take away from it. But I wanted to close up on what I believe is a lot of people's inspiration for this subject or learning about this subject, which is the role of science fiction in our understanding of extraterrestrial life. What do you think science fiction teaches us about space and alien life? What do you think we learn when we are kind of, scrolling through those books at those early ages of our life?
Yeah, so I do think science fiction is important. I mean, science fiction is one of the reasons I'm where I am today. I mean, there were a couple of formative influences on me. One was growing up during the Apollo program with people landing on the moon. So that was because I was 8 in 1969. So that was pretty exciting time, and that left an impact. And the other was reading science fiction. Yeah, and the reason that's important is it kind of even though science fiction describes imaginary worlds, obviously, but by definition, by describing imaginary worlds, it broadens your imagination. So it makes you realize that all of these different things might be possible. I mean, even so, the science fiction might be a story, but well, I found it kind of opened my mind to the possibility that there are more things going on in the universe than we currently suspect. And so all these science fiction authors who've thought about this and developed these ideas in their stories, yeah, I think it's really well, it certainly had an impact on me, and I'd encourage people to read more science fiction. Yeah, just because it lets you see the world through a different lens, a different perspective, which can often be helpful.
Can we speak a little bit more about that then? What science fiction books or films would you recommend people to kind of look at? Is there an actual follow-up question to that? Is there any films or books you think got it right, or do you think any films that were closest to the actual truth of what? I mean, we don't
So
know,
I
but
haven't I haven't seen many films. I mean, for films, for an old film, I will always recommend 2001: A Space Odyssey for its philosophical. I mean, it was 1968, that film. So it's an old film now, but for its philosophical depth and its just considering of. I mean, I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't seen the film or indeed read the story. The 2001: A Space Odyssey was originally a novel by Arthur C. Clarke, but it is an example where the aliens come to us, and then we discover they've come to us, and the story follows from that. I think the movie Arrival, that's a recent movie, does quite a good job at showing the kind of strangeness that aliens might visit us, but they might be much stranger than we can really get to grips with. But that movie also does a good job in highlighting the geopolitical tensions. You'd like to think an alien visitation to the Earth would unite humanity, because then suddenly we'd have a common, well, hopefully not an enemy, but there'd be a common something to be frightened about. And this might unite humanity, and it might. But then the other way of looking at it is we're now so fragmented into nation states that the different nations will just start to try and use this knowledge to their own advantage, and they start be competing amongst themselves to access this alien knowledge. I think Arrival does a pretty good job at showing that like those kind of tensions might happen. Um, so I don't know. As for the novel, as for the stories, I mean, there's such a vast range, isn't there? I mean, I like a lot of Arthur C. Clarke's stories, especially stories like Childhood's End, which also touches on many of the things we've talked about. Where the childhood that comes to an end in that story is our own. Human beings suddenly faced with a much, much bigger universe that we haven't really grasped at all. And so we just have to suddenly grow up because, that's the end of our childhood, being exposed to this universe. Um, Stanislaw Lem, I mean, some of his work is a bit darker. Solaris, his master's voice. I mean, that's an interesting take on SETI, totally unorthodox take on SETI. Anyway, I don't know. There's Olaf Stapleton. Stapleton, maybe many of your readers may not have heard about, but you can Google Stapleton. Stapleton was writing in the 1930s, and he wrote a book called Star Maker, which is just so packed of ideas. Terraforming Dyson spheres, interstellar space travel. All written in like 1933. I mean, it's amazing how old some of these ideas that we've been talking about are. So anyway, I don't know. I can't list all the science fiction that I've read that's influenced me because there's just been too much of it. But I do think that science fiction, yeah, it can open minds, and I wish more people would read it.
I completely agree. And I think, you mentioned how old some of these books are, but they talk about some things we're finding out now, and obviously they would have kind of hypothesized, like imagine a future where we could do this. And it kind of almost feels like our imagination starts to take shape over time, where we kind of go, oh, wait, can we do this? And then we find out that it maybe isn't as simple as it is, but it is very possible. And I think human imagination has an interesting way of kind of bringing to reality these thoughts. And I think the role science fiction has played in my interest in this topic, but a lot of people's interest in this topic is amazing. I think more people should 100% check out science fiction just for that reason. I think it's just interesting, but also I'd love more people to be interested in this topic too. The final question I had to kind of like kind of reflect on the conversation we've had, and again, thank you for your time today. Is that if we are alone, what does it mean? Well, like coming back to kind of question I've been asking kind of all throughout the episode, what does it mean if we are alone? What does it mean on both sides? If we are alone, what does it mean? And if we aren't alone, what does it mean? What do you think? What does that kind of leave us? What do both options leave us?
Well, so I mean, there's a famous quote which is also often attributed to Arthur C. Clarke as well, but I'm not too sure whether he actually said it. But anyway, it's often attributed to him. And it's that there are two possibilities. Either we're alone or we're not. And both of those possibilities are equally terrifying. And they are, because however you view it, I mean, it has to be a fact. Either we're alone or we are not. We don't know, but either way, it's astonishing. Either way, I mean, we either share this universe with lots of other intelligent creatures, many of them which could be presumably much more capable than we are. That could be pretty scary. Or we are literally just alone on this planet, and the rest of the universe is totally empty. So that's terrifying, really, because just the sense of loneliness of it all. But I don't know. I mean, I think all from a scientific point of view, all we can do is to try and find out which of these alternatives is correct. So all we can do is continue to explore the universe around us. But in any case, I still think the main geopolitical task that faces us on this planet, regardless of the answer to that question, is to organize ourselves in such a way that we don't further damage what we do at least know is a wonderful habitable planet with tremendous biodiversity, and whether it's unique or not, it still needs to be preserved. So, and that's our main ethical challenge for the 21st century, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there's a thought process that the more we find out about how uninhabitable these other planets are, the more we'll kind of see what we have here and how beautiful what we have here is and how lucky we have to have this planet of ours. And we should be spending way more time, kind of like trying to make sure that it survives and kind of fighting climate change. But I also, I guess the kid in me loves exploration. So I also think that was also a worthy goal to to explore
Oh
as much as
yes,
we
yeah.
can.
So I do think it's important. Yeah, I do think it's important that these are not seen as mutually exclusive things,
Mhm.
right? Sometimes you do come across an argument. We shouldn't be going out into space until we've sorted out our own planet first,
Mm.
right? This is a false choice. This is a false dichotomy. It is possible for us both to get to grips with looking after our own planet and to explore the rest of the universe. I mean, human beings, we are capable of doing two things at the same time. So these are not mutually exclusive things. I mean, I agree with you. We should be doing them both.
I completely agree. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's
Okay,
been
well, thank
amazing.
you.
I've learned so much. I thank you for your time today.
Yep, thank you, Jeoffrey.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Ian Crawford. Well, thank you.
Thank you.